Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to extend a warm welcome to you for attending the 7th Korean Institute of Criminology International Forum. I'm today's moderator, Jung-Suk Yoon, Director of the International Cooperation Division at Korean Institute of Criminology. It's my pleasure to greet all of you to this virtual conference held under the theme of Challenges of Cybercrime as Opportunities, Prevention, Cooperation, and Safety. The Korean Institute of Criminology International Forum is an annual academic conference which marks its 7th anniversary this year. The forum has brought academics and law enforcement practitioners in the field of crime prevention and criminal justice to discuss various issues, some of which are corruption, terrorism, human rights, evidence-based criminal justice policies, sustainable development goals set forth by the United Nations. The 7th KIC International Forum of this year is jointly organized with Korean Society of Criminology in America and American Society of Criminology Cybercrime Division. The speakers in today's forum will highlight issues related to cybercrime, including an overview of cybercrime, cybersecurity, cyber economic crime, and cyber sex crime. All the speakers are experts and scholars in this field, and through this forum, we are expected to examine cooperative measures and strategies amid an expected increase in online activities and cybercrime during the COVID-19 pandemic. Please conclude the settings for the conference. The entire conference that spans the next 2 days will consist of 2 keynote sessions and 4 thematic sessions. And today, we will proceed the first keynote session and 2 thematic sessions on an overview of cybercrime and cyber economic crime. The forum will be live streamed on YouTube and interpretations in Korean and English will be provided. Thank you. Now, we are going to begin with welcoming remarks by Dr. In-Sup Han, President of the Korean Institute of Criminology. President Han, the floor is yours.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am In-Sup Han, President of the Korean Institute of Criminology. I am pleased to welcome you to the 7th KIC International Forum called Challenges of Cybercrime as Opportunities. We regret COVID-19 prevents us from meeting you face-to-face and acknowledging you personally. A newspaper article on the 1996 World Economic Forum wrote that on the top of the agenda at meeting was dealing with so-called. From the news coverage, one realizes that since the end of the last century, cybercrime has become an issue of international concern. For 2 decades long, KSOCA has been an active role in international society in countering cybercrime. Hosting cybercrime workshop at the UNCCPCJ, launching the project of virtual forum against the cybercrime with UNODC, and contributing to the intergovernmental expert meetings on cybercrime are prime examples of our KIC work. In the current world, cybercrime no longer requires a description, so-called. It is widely acknowledged to pose social harms on people's lives, and so warrants stronger international cooperation for prevention and investigation. One estimate even claims that cybercrime will cost the world more than $6 trillion next year. As cyber technology is rapidly developed and sophisticated, the pattern of cybercrime has become diversified and pervasive. COVID-19 can further accelerate the reach of cybercrime. The theme of this year became cybercrime to reflect this changing reality. I sincerely hope international group of panelists converged virtually for the next 2 days, deliberate and bring forth far-reaching wisdom of cybercrime. As an academic scholar, I look to appreciate and learn from your collective wisdom. In closing, I extend my gratitude to Dr. Kyung-Suk Chu, President of KSOCA, and Dr. Kyung-Sik Choi, Chair of Cybercrime Division of ASG, for co-organizing today's event. I also grateful to Mr. Marco Kunapu, Senior Legal Advisor of Ministry of Justice, Republic of Estonia, and Professor Thomas Holt, Director of the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, and all panelists for their invaluable contributions. With gratitude, I now declare open the 7th KIC International Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Han, for the remarkable speech. Next, we are going to invite congratulatory remarks by Dr. Kyung-Suk Chu, President of the Korean Society of Criminology in America, who has given a lot of support to organizing this forum. President Chu, the floor is yours.
Dear friends and distinguished colleagues, on behalf of the Korean Society of Criminology in America, its acronym KSOCA, I congratulate to KIC on its 7th International Forum. Especially, we are very pleased to participate in this year's forum as co-organizer with KIC. I am Kyung-Suk Chu, President of KSOCA. KSOCA, for those who are not familiar with, is a nonprofit academic organization based in the United States that pursues research and professional activities in criminology and criminal justice system about Korea and the United States. KSOCA is a relatively young yet fast-growing organization since its inauguration in November 2009, about a decade ago. Approximately 100 active KSOCA members who are professors, researchers, and graduate students have been studying on crime and justice system in colleges and universities, as well as research institutes across the United States. As you know, KIC is the only national crime and criminal justice research institute in South Korea, has done a remarkable job of leading national justice policy in South Korea and expanding its role and leadership to many significant international crime issues, such as today's theme, challenges of cybercrime as opportunities, prevention, cooperation, and safety. KIC has also been a tremendous force in reaching out international crime and justice research community and cultivating international collaboration and responses to transnational crimes. At least I can testify what KIC has done with KSOCA this year. For example, KSOCA and KIC worked together for many meaningful joint events and projects. Last month, on November 13, KIC and KSOCA had a virtual joint conference on the theme of COVID-19 and post-pandemic, crime and justice reform in the United States, which was well received from international audience. KIC also supported a research project led by KSOCA member Dr. Seokbum Kim, who will present his findings with his research team in today's forum. These are stellar examples of international partnership that KIC has contributed and continuously strengthened robust research and scholarship at an international level. I would also like to express my special thank you for Dr. Jung-Suk Yoon, the Director of International Cooperation Division at KIC, and Dr. Yong-Ho Jo, the Deputy Director of the same division at KIC, for their assistance for a number of important collaborations with us. We are especially grateful to the presence of KIC, Dr. In-Sub Han, for his generous support to KSOCA over the years. I send my warmest regards to the organizers, participants, and many other KIC staff and professionals, and wish you all the best of luck with today's International Forum. I look forward to continuing our partnership together in the years ahead. Until we see in person in the near future, I hope all of you and your family stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Chu, for your considerate speech. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our first distinguished keynote speaker, Honorable Marko Kunap, Senior Legal Advisor at the Estonia Ministry of Justice, who served as former chair of the Cybercrime Convention Committee at the Council of Europe. Marko Kunap is currently working at the Criminal Policy Department of the Ministry of Justice of Estonia. He is also the member of the Bureau of the Convention Committee on Cybercrime, which is supervising the implementation and dealing with other matters related to the Convention on Cybercrime. Between 2010 and 2014, he was the chair of the committee. As a government representative, he has participated in different European Union, Council of Europe, and United Nations working expert groups, as well as committees on criminal law, criminal procedure, cybercrime, and other cyber-related matters. He has been a consultant, trainer, and speaker on cybersecurity, cybercrime, and criminal justice-related topics, and involved in capacity-building activities and projects worldwide. His topic that he is going to talk about today is Budapest Convention and its second additional protocol. Please help me welcome Mr. Kunap. The floor is yours.
First, I would like to thank you, the organizers, the Korean Institute of Criminology, for giving me an opportunity and an invitation to speak to you about this important topic. I will just first say a few words about the background. What is the overall cyber threat environment? What are the main challenges? What are the instruments that can be used to tackle all these threats? And what could be the way forward? First, as regards cybercrime and as regards cyber threats, then governments as well as different international organizations are constantly reporting about increasing numbers, which are related to cybercrime and other cyber-related threats. Current COVID-19 pandemic has also brought additional challenges, not only for law enforcement authorities worldwide, but for the rest as well. Working from distance online, use of different remote tools, they all have increased vulnerabilities. Low awareness about the threats and the lack of sufficient prevention measures can also facilitate cybercrime. Individuals, businesses, as well as governments, they all suffer more and more from different types of cybercrime. When you think about cybercrime, then cybercrime has also changed as regards its targets and possible impact. We can now also talk about threats to national security, to economy, to the political system of the country. In turn, this all requires effective response from governments who need to take measures to prevent, detect, and investigate cybercrime. The current COVID-19 pandemic has also shown that cybercrime can become even worse, more aggressive, more complicated, and more expensive for everybody. We have seen more attacks against governments and critical infrastructure, including attacks against health sector. This means that the approach and then policy to prevent cybercrime must also change accordingly. And these new policies need to meet new threats and trends. Restrictions, limitations related to physical presence, as well as meetings, remotely working, these have also brought new threats and vulnerabilities. It has also a negative impact on the operation of law enforcement authorities, as well as judiciary. As regards cybercrime, fight against cybercrime, there have been problems related to this already earlier. However, the current situation we are having, I think this amplifies all of them. This means that both businesses and individuals have increased expectations, what governments can do, what governments should do. It is expectation that governments should ensure safe and secure cyberspace and effective response to cybercrime. However, we still have different indications from different parts of the world that only a small fraction of the cybercrime offenses are being reported and investigated. As regards challenges, then there is a need for a joint and effective response to cybercrime. Still, unfortunately, in many countries, legislative framework can be fragmented and countries' capacity to detect and investigate cybercrime is low. This needs to change. Government here have different options. First, there has to be a strategic approach, a policy, how to continue, how to just live, how to continue with this situation. This includes policies, strategies on cybersecurity and cybercrime, as well as necessary supporting legislative framework. As regards criminal justice response to cybercrime, it is important to highlight both substantive and procedural law, as well as proper legislation, proper legal basis enabling effective national and international cooperation. There has to be sufficient capacity, competent specialized institutions to investigate cybercrime, as well as analyze electronic evidence. This also includes digital forensics. Competent authorities need to have all the necessary resources in order to perform their duties. Law enforcement authorities and judiciary, they need to pay attention also to training. As technology is evolving, the same applies to threats. It is of utmost importance that governments can provide up-to-date training for all. Cooperation has been so far and then will be in the future a key issue. Most of the data, computer data or electronic evidence is being stored by private sector entities. There is a need for a legislative framework which would enable swift and smooth cooperation between public and private sector. Building trust and culture of cooperation is relevant because both sides, both public and then private sector, need each other here. Law enforcement authorities should also consider concluding cooperation agreements, memoranda of understanding, in order to make public-private partnership fully effective. Most of the cybercrime offenses and then cyber-related threats are cross-border. This means that legislative and organizational framework is not always sufficient if you focus only on national level cooperation and rely solely on domestic competent authorities. Countries need to learn how to cooperate with each other in a most effective manner. International cooperation is key here. However, this is also an area which needs most attention and then which has most problems. International cooperation requires legal basis for the cooperation, an instrument, available cooperation channels, and both parties who wish to cooperate with each other need to have common minimum standards in place. Otherwise, cooperation between those two countries wouldn't work at all or wouldn't be effective. While most of the threats and incidents are of cross-border nature, governments cannot fight cybercrime alone. As I mentioned, even if country adopts sufficient, up-to-date substantive and then procedural law provisions, criminalizes cybercrime, provides necessary tool for its law enforcement authorities, there is still need to cooperate with other countries as well, because information you need, computer data, electronic evidence, is often abroad. As cybercrime has become a cross-border phenomenon, that means that victims, perpetrators, as well as computer systems used to commit the crime may well locate in different jurisdictions. This applies to computer data or electronic evidence. This is what is needed to investigate the case and identify the perpetrators. International cooperation is often problematic because countries have different views, not only with regard to substantive law, that means what should be considered a cybercrime at all, or they might have also different views how international cooperation should work. Also, as regards response to cybercrime and tools at international level, then every country needs to think and then analyze what could be the options here, and then how to improve its legislative framework, organizational framework, as well as international cooperation. Currently, there is only one internationally legally binding instrument on cybercrime and electronic evidence. It is the Convention on Cybercrime, also known as the Budapest Convention. As regards substantive law, procedural law, legal basis for international cooperation, Budapest Convention can serve as a model here because it provides this. It is also important to note that the provisions of the convention can also be addressed to investigate other criminal offenses where electronic evidence is involved. The convention uses language that is technology neutral, and that means that it can be applied to different types of cybercrime. It can be considered as an instrument on cybercrime and electronic evidence, which also has a global impact. Many countries, at the moment 65 countries, have already joined the convention, but even more have used it as a guide to develop and update the domestic legislation, including on substantive and procedural law. Convention is also being used on a daily basis for international cooperation and to exchange information. Convention can be used to request preservation, production, and real-time access of data from another party. In addition to mutual legal assistance tools and then cooperation between central authorities, it also provides cooperation through its 24/7 network and points of contact. However, there is still room for improvement in order to ensure effective and timely access to electronic evidence that is being stored abroad. In particular, when we are talking about cloud computing and data being stored somewhere in the cloud. When speaking about electronic evidence, one has to think about its characteristics, in particular, its volatile nature. Computer data can be copied, moved, deleted very quickly, and this may involve computer systems in multiple jurisdictions. It is often the case that exact location, physical location of the data remains unknown, in particular when law enforcement authorities face so-called dark web investigations. And then this is a problem. The question is how to ensure timely access to data, how to secure the data, and then how to obtain the data if it's stored abroad. Budapest Convention already contains several procedural measures related to, as I mentioned, preservation, production, real-time access to data. However, as we are thinking about how data can move really fast across the borders, across different jurisdictions, it might not be sufficient at the moment. As regards internet, as regards cyberspace, there are no boundaries for individuals in cyberspace. They can do whatever they want. They can copy, move, delete data as they wish, in particular when it comes to different cloud computing services. However, for the law enforcement, these boundaries still exist. And if they want to pursue, if they want to trace the data, if they want to collect the data, then rules and then principles on international cooperation still apply. As existing or traditional mutual legal assistance frameworks were not designed to address electronic evidence, don't provide necessary speed and effectiveness, there is a need to develop additional tools. Now I'm also just referring to the discussions related to second additional protocol to the convention. Consultations related to the second additional protocol to the Budapest Convention have been taking place for years. In September 2017, the Cybercrime Convention Committee started to draft and negotiate text of the protocol. The main goal is to provide, in addition to existing traditional mutual legal assistance frameworks, also new measures and additional tools for law enforcement to obtain electronic evidence from abroad. These tools would, of course, complement existing measures and would cover inter alia direct cooperation with multinational service providers, these cloud providers, we can say, and also faster procedures for emergency situations. Idea is also to find ways how to facilitate, how to make traditional mutual legal assistance more effective. Negotiations related to the protocol haven't been finalized yet, but we all hope that the new protocol would provide additional tools related to electronic evidence and make fight against cybercrime more effective. Information about the convention, as well as negotiations on the second additional protocol, is publicly available at the Council of Europe's Cybercrime Convention Committee website. As regards the text of the protocol, then several provisions have been already provisionally agreed and made public to facilitate discussions and consultations with all relevant stakeholders, in particular with private sector. We hope to achieve a result that would suit everybody, a result, an outcome that would provide necessary added value related to fight against cybercrime. And we believe that the text of the protocol would be opened for signature already next year in 2021. Once again, I would like to thank the organizers of this forum for giving me an opportunity to speak about this. I hope to meet you all personally in the future, and I wish you a successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knop, for all the detailed explanations about setting forth the Budapest Convention and also additional protocol drafting, and all the information would be very helpful to kind of combat the cybercrime and to strengthen the international cooperation between the different countries. Thank you so much. Now we are going to have an intercession break for about 15 minutes. The first thematic session after this keynote session will start at 2:45 p.m. We'll see you after a while. Have a good break. We'll see you in a while. Thank you. Okay, everybody, now we're going to start the first thematic session. I would like to remind our speakers that they have a maximum of 20 minutes for their presentation, with 30 minutes allotted for panel discussion and Q&A session. The first session will address an overview of cybercrime. We have invited three distinguished scholars in this field: Professor Michael McGuire of University of Surrey in the UK, Dr. Seokbom Kim, researcher of Utica College in the United States, and Professor Yoon-sik Jang of Hallym University in Korea. Now, let's have first speaker, Professor Michael McGuire. Professor McGuire has got a PhD degree from King's College of London, and he is currently working as a senior lecturer in criminology of University of Surrey. He worked as a chair of European Society of Criminology Working Group on Politics, Science, and Technology. He is also a member of International Interdisciplinary Research Consortium on Cybercrime. His topic today is Rethinking Cybercrime, the Evolution of a Digital Deviance Within a Digital Economy. Professor McGuire, you have the floor.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this talk at the KRC International Forum, which is about definitions of cybercrime, conceptualizations of cybercrime, and I'm going to talk about that challenge in relation to some research I've done recently about the way that cybercriminals generate revenues and function within kind of what I call a cybercrime economy. The challenge of defining cybercrime in a way seems like it's gone away. We all sort of think we know what cybercrime is, and I've argued against that. I think there's a number of challenges with how we define and explain cybercrime, and here's three that I've flagged up for you. First of all, there are the fundamental conceptual and definitional problems. Do we have a universalist approach? Do we try and think that there's a definition of cybercrime that covers all kinds of cybercrimes? Or do we think we can only apply certain definitions, the particularist approach, to particular cybercrimes? Or thirdly, do we just think that the whole exercise is a waste of time? We're agnostic about it, we're skeptical about it, and we think let's just not bother about defining cybercrime, let's just get on with policing it and enforcing it. Second related challenge is then, if we do come up with a definition that we're satisfied with, to what extent does that fit with the evidence? Is the way that we define cybercrime something that cybercriminals are actually doing? Finally, thirdly, is our definition, is our conceptualization of any use? Can we apply it on the ground to specific activities that cybercriminals are engaged in, and does it help us make sense or do something about it? And indeed, what are the connections here? Really, with cybercrime, we've got a fundamental challenge. Do we go with the fact that cybercrime appears to use technology and that the technology is fundamental to it, or do we try and get around that and come up with a non-technological definition? Here's one example of something I did in my work a few years ago, where I tried to develop a non-technological definition. And this focuses on the idea that as with the idea of cyberspace, there's something spatial going on. And that spatiality comes from the kinds of connections that the internet and digital technologies enable us to engage in. In fact, there are so many of these connections, whether it is to what we're saying, how we talk to people, how we access data, that many people now talk about the idea of hyperconnectedness, hyperconnection. We're in a hyperconnected world. And just as we used to think that engaging with computers created cyberspace, maybe hyperconnection, hyperconnectedness creates a kind of a hyperspace, in which case we derive then a nice little definition in the same way as cybercrime comes from cyberspace. Maybe we can think about hypercrime coming from hyperspace. Well, personally, I think this is a good and profitable direction to go on. But of course, most people don't use the concept of hypercrime. They still talk about cybercrime. So it looks like we're kind of stuck with the term, and it looks like, therefore, we're stuck with a kind of technological definition. So when we think about the technologically driven definition of cybercrime, what we kind of think about is things like cybercrime is the misuse of computers. That's certainly how it used to be defined, or maybe it's a misuse of digital technology. But there's a number of problems there with that, aren't there, once we start to drill down a bit. Is it computers, as people used to think, or is it, as people increasingly realized, it was about the network rather than the computer? Can we even talk about computers? Are computers the same kind of thing now as they were in the 1990s when cybercrime began to emerge with cloud computing and so on? The computer as a device is increasingly less central. So is it about the network, or is it about other developments of the network, such as wireless technologies and new developments coming down the line? In other words, we have a device impermanence. The technology we use to define cybercrime is constantly changing, and that's not a good thing for conceptions and definitions. We want these to be, particularly if we want to be universal about them, we want to be permanent. Second problem is related to what does this technology do and how does it function within the definition? What kind of agency do we as human actors have in using the technology, or is it all the technology that does the job? And how do we cause anything? Is it us causing something, or is it the device? And if it's the device causing it, then what relevance do we as human actors have? And some of you might be familiar with this challenge in one of the standard definitions of cybercrime, which relates to it as computer-dependent crime, distribution of malware, viruses, and so on, or cyber-enabled crime, things like fraud, online sexual offending, and so on. There's this big schism, this big conceptual divide, which I don't think really has been successfully bridged yet. Is cybercrime computer-dependent, or is cybercrime computer-enabled? And that leads us to the third problem, the third challenge with a technological definition, which is right back with us, human actors. How do we account for human factors? How do we account for the role of the social world in our definition of cybercrime if technology is playing such a central definitional role? So how do we incorporate these human social factors into our definitions at the same time as avoiding what's sometimes called technological determinism, everything being decided by the technology? Well, in the research that I did, I tried to respond to this challenge by looking at what cybercriminals actually did. And one of the things that they do, clearly most frequently, is try and make money, try and generate revenues. So starting from this point of revenue generation, it looked like it could answer the three challenges that I mentioned earlier on. It seems like it might be a universal definition. It would enable us to map cybercrime activity as a whole. It seems like it could also be particular, because it would tell us about what individual cybercriminals are doing at any given offending moment. They're motivated by acquiring some value or some benefit to themselves. And finally, it does seem to have an applied dimension. If revenue generation is what's fundamental to cybercrime, then maybe we could use that to intervene, to disrupt revenue networks and revenue flows. So the research this was based on is called the Web of Profit. There was 3 reports here. I won't go into all of them now because of time. The first report, the Web of Profit itself, looked at the cybercrime economy, how much it generates. The second report looked at the role of certain elements of this economy, which is social media platforms. How do they generate money? How do they enable cyber criminals? And then the third report looked at perhaps the more familiar aspect of what cyber criminals do in terms of hidden markets, the dark market, the invisible net, and so on. We used a variety of different methodologies for this piece of research. There was interviews that we conducted, some of it with actually convicted cyber criminals, and they told us how they were spending money and generating their money, practitioners and so on. We did a lot of observation. We looked at different social media platforms, both in Europe and the West and Russia and China, which I think is a very important unexplored area of cybercrime activity. We looked at what was going on a sample of 15 darknet platforms over a specified time period, and we actually engaged with some of the vendors on those platforms, trying to do transactions, try and buy and sell things. And then finally, we analysed a lot of the data that we had, things like commodities that were being sold on darknet markets, what prices they were reaching. And then we looked at a whole variety of other bits of data and tried to find some patterns in that, social media post uploads, photos, and so on. What we found was very complex, and there were many, many things that I could talk about here, but since we have very limited time, I'm going to talk about 2 things which could be specifically related to the question of definition. The first one is, as I've kind of suggested, that revenue generation seems to suggest within cybercrime the emergence of something we can think of as a cybercrime economy. And that points to the second finding, which is the need to develop a much better socio-economic conception in our definitions of cybercrime. So the cybercrime economy clearly is a dynamic, it's an economy of flows, as the theorist Manuel Castells once described it, the digital economy. It involves generating revenues. These revenues are then moved around in different ways. They're laundered, they're spent. And in turn, they are reinvested sometimes in cybercrime, sometimes in other kinds of crime, things, concerning things like terrorism. So it's a dynamic, flowing thing, and our definitions of cybercrime have to reflect that inherent dynamism, I think. Like any economy, it's got certain fundamental features. Now, in our industrial or in industrial and service economies, we think about raw materials like metal and steel and coal, and they get fed into the economy, and from them they're turned into other things and wealth results. Well, of course, in the digital economy, and the cybercrime economy is part of that, has its very, very own and unique raw material data. And that might be everything from the kind of company databases you can buy on the dark net through to things like loyalty points, likes and dislikes on social media sites. They're all things that can be traded in, that can be bought and sold, along with more familiar examples such as our personal identification details. Like any economy, there are many ways in which wealth is generated. All economies are about wealth generation. The cybercrime economy, when you start to look at it, it's really surprising just how many ways now. It's not just simple data theft any longer. There's all kinds of ways in which cybercriminals can make money. So yes, they steal data and they trade in data, they buy and sell data, but they also do things like they buy tools and they sell tools. They use their cybercrime skills and online resources to generate a huge volume of trade in things like counterfeit goods, prescription pharmaceuticals, illegal drugs, and so on. There is a trade in the buying and selling of skills, using consultancy to improve your botnet or whatever it might be. There is a dedicated currency, which I'll come on to in a minute, which is bought and sold. And there is a trade in things like company secrets, intellectual property. There is money made from extortion, and so on. I could, cite many other examples. But all of this is rooted, again, as I just suggested, in a kind of a currency. And currencies are fundamental to economies. Economies can't function unless there is a fluidity of exchange of value through transactions and buying and selling and so on. And of course, the digital economy, and increasingly the cybercrime economy, trades on these digital currencies now, whether it's digital payment systems, whether it's peer-to-peer banking, and the hundreds really now of cryptocurrencies that now exist. The example of how important they are, it's estimated that around about $2.8 billion were money laundered over Bitcoin exchanges last year. That's a doubling from the previous year. So the currency element of the cybercrime economy is absolutely fundamental, but there are many, many other features as well. We all know about darknet markets and dark web situations. So these are dedicated marketplaces. Familiar economies, the legitimate economy, we think about things like the stock market, like other kinds of marketplaces, online marketplaces like eBay, Amazon, and so on. Well, cybercrime has got its own examples. It's also got supply centers, where raw materials are processed and developed into wealth-generating commodities. And this example here of this famous Romanian village is sometimes referred to as Hackerville. There's a huge hacker economy here that's been reported. How big is this economy? Well, we measured it to be valued at around $1.5 trillion annually. And that's a conservative estimate for lots and lots of reasons, which I haven't got time to go into here. But that's a staggering amount of money. It breaks down kind of as follows, in ways which we found a little bit surprising in the research. Actually, the biggest component of this economy is the trading that's done across illegal online markets with things like counterfeit goods, pharmaceuticals, and so on. About $860 billion per annum that's worth. Trade secret IP theft, about $500 billion. Trading in data, surprisingly not quite so much, $160 billion. Right down to things like crimeware, which of course we associate as a paradigmatic cybercrime good, actually generating a lot less money than perhaps the less obvious types of activity within this economy. The fact that there's so much money being generated within the cybercrime economy, I think, has to be seen as something very significant. I mean, for example, just as a comparison, we can see that it generates more money than the combined revenues of the top 3 Fortune 500 companies. It generates a amount of wealth and revenues which is larger than the GDP of many nation states, including states, wealthy states like Saudi Arabia. And perhaps more importantly, it generates a huge amount of resources. And that means that new cyber criminals are constantly coming into the field because they want a piece of the action. It allows, as I've suggested, quite a significant volume of money to be reinvested back into cybercrime and crime. It blends with the legitimate economy and distorts it in ways which I'll come back to in a minute. And as a result, it fosters the interest of other larger actors, amongst them nation states, to get involved in cybercrime. So the idea of the fact that the legitimate economy becomes blurred with the cybercrime economy, I think is something that's very significant, and we're only beginning to make sense of this. I mean, money laundering, I've already mentioned. The fact that there's huge amounts of money being laundered in the world, increasingly a lot of that comes from the cybercrime economy, and increasingly legitimate actors like banks. We know the famous case with HSBC, the global laundromat scandal that took place a couple of years ago when HSBC was found to be involved in enabling laundering on a global scale. So the cybercrime economy, as it grows, is distorting the legitimate economy and making actually the boundary between crime and non-crime harder to trace. And one of the ways in which this blurring is taking place is by a new kind of cybercrime tool. And I'm writing a book about this at the moment called Platform Criminality. And this is the digital platform. Many people, and for example, the writer Nick Chernikek has written a book called Platform Capitalism. And he suggests that just as, say, generation of industrial goods in the early industrial revolution was one of the big ways in which wealth was generated. Now, the most money being generated in the legitimate economy comes from digital platforms like Facebook, like Amazon, like eBay, and so on. And we have a range of platforms in the cybercrime world, whether it's darknet markets, whether it's other sort of personal forums that cybercriminals use to buy and sell goods. The platform becomes a new kind of cybercrime tool. And with it becomes, from a criminological perspective, I think a very, very interesting development in that crime is no longer the primary activity for cybercriminals for generating wealth. There's a first order level of crime, perhaps where data is stolen or a hack is done, but then the commodities generated from that go into this wider economy, and you get a kind of what I call second order criminality, a trading of crime upon crime. And I think this is a historic change in the nature of what crime and criminality is. So to conclude, last couple of slides, what should we do and how does this cybercrime economy affect how we define cybercrime? Well, one approach is, as I highlighted in the beginning of the talk, to take what might be called the skeptical agnosticist approach. Say, we don't do anything. Who cares? All we can do is get on with identifying what cyber criminals do and helping law enforcement then disrupt that. You could go to another end of the scale and say, well, look, actually, this is so significant, we've got to throw out our old definitions of cybercrime completely and come up with something new, maybe a kind of a hypercrime type idea. Or perhaps what it means is that cybercrime will increasingly be defined in terms of its particular activities, the particularist approach. So what we will get is a kind of a fragmented field of cybercrime, which certain activities are foregrounded over others. So you have the kind of economic, financial cybercrime, which I've been talking about in this discussion, which of course is by far the largest, generates the largest volume of cybercrime activity and the most revenues. But then you have other types of activity that we're also concerned about, other ways in which online digital technology cause harm, such as sexual cybercrime, perhaps, hate speech online, hate-based cybercrime, and so on. This could be one future for how we define cybercrime, to fragment it into these different definitions. Or, to conclude, it may be, and this is something that I think a lot of people have considered, that cybercrime or digital technology becomes such a fundamental activity, or such a fundamental tool for criminals to use, that actually there's no difference between crime and cybercrime any longer. Every crime, to some extent, is enabled by digital technology, whether you're planning, a bank robbery by talking to somebody over the internet, whether you're using 3D copiers to make guns and getting plans and blueprints for over the internet. Maybe at every level in the next 10 to 15 years, digital crime is going to permeate crime in general, so that we won't need a definition of cybercrime at all. Either way, The question of definition and the question of conceptualization, which is often forgotten about when we think about cybercrime, because we are very target fixated. We are very fixated on measuring what cyber criminals are doing. I'd like to conclude by just reminding all of us that we shouldn't forget that defining cybercrime is fundamental to how we think about cybercrime. If we don't get that right, then we might as well forget the whole business from square one. Thank you very much for listening to this talk, and I shall look forward to answering some of your questions when you put them forward to me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. McGuire, for sharing very interesting research findings with us, and also new suggestion about the definition of a cybercrime by emerging digital economy into that definition. And it was very interesting for the suggestion that incorporating a more developed economic dimension into our conceptualization of cybercrime. Personally, I heard a lot, very interestingly. More discussion will follow in the panel discussion session. Now, let's have our second speaker. Our second presentation is given by Dr. Seokbum Kim. Dr. Seokbum Kim is Research Associate of Student Computer Forensics and Digital Evidence Educational Opportunities Program, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the U.S. Department of Justice. He has earned a PhD degree at the University of Massachusetts Lowell with a major of Criminology and Justice Studies. He worked at the Public Safety Division of Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency. His main research areas are quantitative methods and statistics, theories of crime, policing, victimology, data intelligence analysis, cybercrime, and comparative criminology. His topic that he is going to present today is on the metric of cybercrime. Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. This is Dr. Seokbum Kim. So today I'm gonna briefly talk about some general issues about measuring cybercrime. Like a definition of a cybercrime, what kind of cybercrime data has been measured, and at what level has a cybercrime data has been collected, who is the victim of a cybercrime, how reliable is the cybercrime data. Then we will discuss about the metrics of cybercrime. So based on Uniform Crime Reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey, two important sources of crime data in the United States, a commonly accepted fact is that the rate of serious violent crime and property crime has shown a downward trend. As you can see in the graph, the South Korea also see a downward trend in offline crime. However, the official index crime rates has been criticized, failing to capture the reality of the crime directly or indirectly related to cyberspace. So with the development of ICT, criminals have an opportunity to change their modus operandi. Therefore, traditional offline crimes like fraud, stalking, and harassment evolved into the new form of cybercrime, even drug crimes. For example, according to the DEA in the United States, criminals use the dark web to sell illegal drugs over eBay-like illicit markets. These transactions are usually made using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. The ordered drugs are shipped via international packages. As a result, some experts warned about a new phase of opioid epidemic in the US. So another example is that the annual number of sensitive digital data breaches have surged along with increasing financial losses incurred by such breaches. Again, the current official crime data did not capture these types of crime. Maybe little evidence exists so far about crime migration from offline to online. However, the lack of cybercrime data hinders our understanding of addressing the evolving nature of cybercrime. So generally, the importance of robust measurement and collection of cybercrime data is related to accurately defined crime problems. Also, we can inform and aware the public regarding their criminal victimization. From a law enforcement perspective, accurate cyber data can justify obtaining funding and resources to address cybercrime. The first is about the definition of cybercrime. Earlier, Dr. McGuire addressed this issue beautifully, so I make a very quick thinking about the definitions of cybercrime. So, as a former law enforcement, it is very difficult to establish a specific definition of a cybercrime. Cybercrime, computer crime, computer-enabled crime, all these terms are used interchangeably, but there is no settled definition of cybercrime. This makes a lot of confusion about law enforcement work. Therefore, the interpretation of cybercrime differ from academic or professional point of view and from country by country. So, as Dr. McGuire says, we need to more effort to establish the settled definition of cybercrime. The second issue is about what kind of cyber data we are collecting. In the United States, among the 52 NIVRS Group A offenses, so-called the most serious offenses, only one category listed under fraud offenses called hacking and computer invasion is only designated for cybercrime. In contrast, South Korea law enforcement maintained more detailed categorization and classification. Because it is very difficult to add or change crime category in the official data does not easily adapt to new cybercrime such as ransomware or sextortion. In this regard, South Korea official data is more responsive to the current cybercrime trend. The victimization survey is an important tool for estimating cybercrime. Especially, it can measure unreported cybercrime, so-called hidden crime, and threat or risk of cybercrime. Also, due to the flexibility of the survey contents, it is possible to capture the current trend of cybercrime without any regulation. So we need to more focus on how to use the victimization survey to capture the current cybercrime trend. A second issue is about at what level has data been collected so far. In South Korea, victims of cybercrime voluntarily report their incidents to the police. This initial reporting consists of approximately 80% of entire received cybercrime cases in South Korea. After initial investigation, about 56% of received crime reports were classified as official crime rate, official crime. Therefore, local, regional, and national crime statistics can be collected through a centralized police system in South Korea. In contrast, in the U.S., there's a very little is known about the level of the data collection method in the U.S. In the U.S., local, regional, and national cybercrime statistics can be collected through NIVRS, but very limited to certain crime like hacking and the fraud crime, as mentioned earlier. In the U.S., the most important thing is that jurisdictional issues are the most difficult to solve. Many cybercrimes are committed out of state or internationally. Some states has broadened their jurisdiction rules, but it is very difficult to prosecute cybercrime criminals outside the state. So, for example, the total cybercrime handled by the Massachusetts Attorney General's office for the last 3 years is only 17 cases. This number was surprisingly low. These features hinder the understanding of the extent and the prevalence of cybercrime. The next issue of cybercrime is related to counting the occurrence of cybercrime. In 2017, the hacking incidents of Equifax, one of the 3 largest consumer credit reporting agencies in the US, exposed almost half of the American credentials like Social Security number, driver license number, and credit card number. The question arises from whether we should consider these data breaches as one incident or 147.9 million cases. Precisely who is the victim of data breach caused by hacking is very difficult to handle with. The crime occurrence rate largely depends on the method of counting. So we should delve into this type of counting issue more and more. The final issue is about the reality of the cybercrime data, reliability of the cybercrime data. As you can see in trend, the use of a smartphone and the number of forensic service requests seems to be correlated with each other. But the official cybercrime data area seems to be a little bit fluctuate year by year. This fluctuation might be related to the reporting system. As we already saw just before, the reported cybercrime was initially reviewed or consulted by a police officer. During this process, a substantial amount of reported cybercrime was excluded for the subsequent criminal investigation. So this, in the future, this kind of initial filtering process of the Korean police should be regulated by some kind of objective guidelines. Regarding US NIVRS, it is reported that only approximately 44% of local law enforcement joined the NRBRS system. Furthermore, FBI acknowledged that NIBRS is estimated to cover only 12% of cybercrime. When we interviewed a patrol officer in Massachusetts, they acknowledged that cybercrime like cyber stalking was not included in the crime data simply because there is no NIBRS code for cyber stalking. So the NIBRS system allows for coding when the crime takes place in cyberspace. Nevertheless, it is very difficult to detect a full range of cybercrime within NIBRS system. So we need to, regarding the measuring cybercrime, the need to define, categorize, and track cybercrime is imperative. We can consider to develop so-called index cybercrime to measure and compare cybercrime across countries. And it is necessary to consider a way of complementing cybercrime official data based on victimization survey so that each source of cybercrime can be used to solve problems that the other cannot. So thank you for listening to my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kim. I would like to add that this presentation is actually based on the research collaboration between the KIC and KSOCA, which is Korean Society of Criminalists in America. And I recognize Dr. Kim's and your research team's effort to kind of delve into the measurement issues of cybercrime, which sounds really difficult to define and also measure across the different jurisdictions. And I want to actually hear about the panel discussion. In the panel discussion, the discussants, opinion about setting the index crime in the cybercrime. Okay, so more discussion will follow in the panel discussion. Okay, so we're going to move into the third presentation. The third presentation, which is the last presentation of this session, is given by Professor Yoon-sik Jang. Professor Jang is Assistant Professor of Legal Informatics and Forensic Science, School of Global Studies, Hallym University. He started his career as a Korean National Police and lectured as a police professor and director of International Cybercrime Research Center at Korean National Police University. Since 2015, he has been a professor of Hallym University and director of Institute of Legal Informatics and Forensic Science there. His major research interests are cybercrime and policing, digital forensic investigation, and law enforcement training. The topic that he's going to present today is key issues in cybercrime capacity building. Dr. Jang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for the cordial introduction. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Yoon-sik Jang. I'm working for Legal Informatics and Forensic Science, focusing cybercrime and digital forensics in Hallym University, which is in Chuncheon City. I'm very grateful to the KIC for allowing me to speak in this international forum for cybercrime. What I'm going to talk about today is the key issues in cybercrime capacity building, especially focusing on law enforcement. Criminal justice has a primary responsibility to handle criminal matters. It may include prevention, mitigation, detection, investigation, prosecution, and adjudication of crime and criminals, though cybercrime is not an exception. To do those jobs properly, criminal justice agents need different tools, capabilities, especially for cybercrime they have never experienced before. So easily, capacity building in criminal justice or cybercrime capacity, shortly CCB hereafter for myself, became a focus of national cybercrime policies, open cybersecurity policies more broadly. Since around 2000, there have been a lot of international CCP programs and projects to reduce the capacity gaps among countries. Some of them were conducted as a part of international development cooperation among donors and recipients. Today, I would focus more on the issues in the CCP programs which are implemented between developed and developing country relations. Unfortunately, regarding time constraint, let me skip some slides. For example, this is prepared to distinguish the cybercrime matters from other cyber agendas. We discussed cybercrime definition so far, focusing to distinguish from other crimes, but one thing we have to address is cybercrime should be distinguished from other cyber agendas, including cybersecurity, something like that. So, but it's too long, so let me skip it. Okay, sorry for that. Simply put, capacity building is to be armed with organizational and individual capabilities to solve problems, including physical infrastructure and equipment, knowledge and skills, and other resources. One definition of CCB was proposed by the Council of Europe, saying cybercrime capacity building is enabling criminal justice authorities to meet the challenge of cybercrime and electronic evidence. See, it's about criminal justice of authorities, it's about cybercrime, but it's also about electronic evidence. You know, not all digital evidence is for cybercrime, but more for non-cybercrime. Anyway, most of all, the deficit of law enforcement capacity against cybercrime and e-evidence have been complained a lot, as you know. One thing to stress is that in the context of international development, the focus have been moved from physical and financial infrastructure to human resources development and organizational and institutional development for the last decades. Simply do not buy something for them, rather teach them, rather change their society and organization. That is a reflection of experiences in the international development cooperations. And now, what would be CCB for law enforcement agencies? As organizations, many of law enforcement agencies are named police. That is, the law enforcement is just the police. But in terms of functionalities, law enforcement and policing might be different. Law enforcement is focused on investigation and punishment and deterrence through them. As you know, classical criminological theory focuses on deterrence by reactive punishment. Policing is regulation for maintenance of order, especially for crime prevention. Some police theories focuses more on the anticipating and proactive prevention measures. We may think of community policing, problem-oriented policing, and some more on this. Without doubt, the police do policing in conventional fashion. But how about the cyberspace? What the police do on cyberspace for the purpose of policing? Does police regulate internet access and activities? Is the case? So one problem is to decide what to do against the cybercrime on cyberspace and the role of law enforcement agencies when considering CCB plans, especially in network of cybersecurity. To illustrate my point more, let me introduce the case of Korean police. As you know, Korea is quite advanced in ICT, and now cyber policing is a mainstream in police. They have cyber bureau separated from criminal investigation bureau. It's unlike the case of the most of jurisdictions. As of 2019, more than 11% of all crimes were categorized as cybercrime in Korea. and 1.5% of police forces are cyber police officers exclusively. To my knowledge, this is the ratio in the world. Since the establishment of Cyber Bureau and implementation of Cyber Safety Master Plan in 2013, Korean police prioritized cybercrime prevention. Many policies for cybercrime prevention have been implemented and evaluated. I introduced some preventive measures taken by Korean police using the situational crime prevention frameworks. The Korean police have qualified cybercrime prevention instructors. They actually teach in the school. We observed many young people carefully listen to cyber cops, get effective in raising cybercrime awareness. They have cyber neighborhood watch program as well. They developed several apps to alert and inform cybercrime and to receive cybercrime report. They received approximately 240,000 cybercrime reports using PC and mobile apps only in 2019. Quite remarkable numbers. This kind of the police activities are not common in most of jurisdictions out of Korea. Who and how do the police able to develop the better policies for cybercrime prevention? Again, I think the uniqueness of Korean police may demonstrate the diverse possibilities in developing cybercrime response activities, especially in my point, the CCB as well. So we sometimes may develop a best practice model for a complex job to illustrate the relation of elements of work to guarantee the best outputs and outcomes. Then we may develop a best practice model to illustrate the required organizational and individual elements and processes to solve cybercrime from the top to bottom. I drew the diagram to depict complexity among many different factors in considering CCB. In the top level, international and national dimension, governance, norm, principle, and other issues might be discussed. As you know, in some countries, free flow of information is important, but security is more important in other countries. In some countries, digital evidence exchange is more important, when sovereignty is more important in other countries. Some claims multi-stakeholderism, when others prefer intergovernmental approaches. Cybercrime and/or cybersecurity strategies may declare that what are value and principles to pursue, what are goals to achieve, what to do by whom, and so on. So, national cybersecurity strategies have been implemented in many countries, and international organizations publicize guidelines for development of cybersecurity strategies. In conventional cybercrime training focuses were in the lowest level activities, unfortunately. They learned how to identify criminals and analyze digital forensics, mostly for deterrence purposes. However, even though lack of macro level capacity might be more fundamental and serious, those issues have rarely discussed in the most of the training programs. Now, let me talk more about international cooperation for CCB. It's natural that the resource, knowledge, and skills are more seriously insufficient in developing countries. Considering the nature of borderless cybercrime and even to contribute the international development cooperation and law enforcement cooperation in general, CCB was easily selected as a theme for international cooperation. The need of CCB have been recognized in many international dialogues, even in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Based on international dialogues, there are a number of actual CCB activities, multilateral and bilateral. Multilateral activities are usually coordinated by international organizations, among others. I think the Council of Europe's CCB activities are the most active, requiring legislation based on Convention on Cybercrime. There are also bilateral programs. As just one example, we have a project between Bangladesh police and KSOCA. KSOCA is an agency responsible for international development grants in Korea. I mentioned about a best practice model framework for discussion. Then what elements would be included in national level CCB programs? A model, again, proposed by Council of Europe encompasses 12 areas for CCB. Among 12 areas, I think at least 10 of them, red colored in the slide, are closely related to the police. However, there are some inherent pitfalls in international cooperation. So most of all, it's costly, including travel cost, needless to say, and international cooperations are based on friendly relationship, which may make it very hard to criticize objectively. I think we don't have many researches and publications on the matter, somewhat because of it. Various participants and differences also make CCP cooperation difficult, even including language barrier. Let me talk more specifically in conventional cybercrime trainings. Trainees visit trainers' places to learn the best practices. Once trained, the trainees are expected to come back to their country and teach their people as a trainer with their own training program. We expect to teach fishing instead of feeding a person. However, the expectation is hardly realized. Many of trainings are the lack of so-called quality training. Many training programs are training and trainers are ad hoc, not well developed, not permanently residential. Many programs are so too short to teach inexperienced persons. In many cases, trainees are not qualified. In many cases, training pathway were not considered, which make incremental learning difficulty. In my experience, I met some officers who have never used computer mice by their hands before the training. In an international trainer program. And most of the training focuses on how low technical skills, and they have a rare chance to have knowledge about managerial capability for cybercrime policing. Furthermore, I think there are more fatal organizational problems which may make all of the training effort insufficient. First, many officers, especially in developing countries, don't want to work in cybercrime unit. I heard some reasons from different countries, but I think it's not appropriate to mention the details. Even if any officers are well trained, it's common to fail in retention of the trained officers. Unlike expectation, teaching a trainer often doesn't contribute to organizational capacity enhancement because conversion of test knowledge of individual to exploiting knowledge of organization is not well managed in developing countries. Sometimes we observe that the newly learned skill were misused mostly for political reasons. There are some efforts to address those issues I mentioned. One of them are to make training courses based on the competency standard required for jobs and positions. The diagram in the slide shows one of them. I think we need to develop much more to be implemented practically. I may know cybersecurity workforce, you may know cybersecurity workforce framework in the US, and we have Korean police's cybercrime competency standard model for entire police. Regardless of international standardization, we may need any of competency framework to adopt in CCB project in accordance with the recipient organization regulations. Now let me talk the recipient-based model that many projects adopted. In the model, different trainers visit the trainees and provide customized program to them. And so recently it's more prevalent. Required model is not best practice, but best fit model for recipient. If the provided model is not fit well in the recipient country, it wouldn't work as expected and it wouldn't be sustainable. The problem is that developing suitable CCB model for a recipient is an extremely hard job. Competency standard is just one of the problems we face. Again, for illustration, let me introduce Bangladesh-Korea CCB project between 2012 to 16. Grant size was approximately $3 million. Obviously, immediate expected output of the project were competent cybercrime unit for cyber investigation and digital forensics. Initially, there was a goal to general IT training capability. The goal has been eliminated later because they developed a much larger IT capacity initiative by themselves. Instead, we expanded their focus from cyber crime investigation to overall cyber policing to name their organization as Cyber Police Center. For this, we constructed their offices, procured hardware and software, and we trained them, and we dispatched experts to consult for organizational management capabilities. This is the facility and equipment provided. This is overall training development framework divided into manager training and train the trainer programs. We designed the various training components regarding training path, cost, goals, etc. The pictures shows various training activities in Korea and Bangladesh. For management, we identified 3 areas: infrastructure, human resources, and operation and activities. Strategies, policies, plans, SOPs, and manuals were developed for them. This project evaluated successful by the KSOCA and Bangladesh government. So from the end of this year, the KSOCA will grant the second phase of project with around $5 million this time. So based on the task so far, let me point out some key issues divided into national and organizational level. To be more effective, CCB project should be national, not only for law enforcement. For sustainable development, the policy may need to be financially supported, organizationally prioritized. Principles and other top-level cybercrime best practice elements should be discussed and documented as early as possible. Harmonization with existing national strategies and policies is essential, which may require much more research and feasibility study before planning. That's I always regret. Object need assessment and the need goal setting is important because we may have different goals for cybercrime. As I mentioned, international development focus moves from infrastructure to management and governance, but it's common that the recipient prepare infrastructure first, the steps capacity next, and management, the government rest. So their interests sometimes conflict between recipient to donor. For project development and implementation, forming consensus among participating stakeholders are extremely important. Cybersecurity and cybercrime are never being discussed in the same understanding. Management trainings are not easy. Is it working? Yeah. And management trainings are not easy and often neglected. It should be strategically approached. We need more R&D about CCB even in developed countries, because we don't have cybercrime statistics in any developed countries as well. For example, cybercrime statistics is not easy. So doing it in developing countries is even harder. We need cybercrime capacity assessment too, because we don't know how to assess the capability. Then how can we decide how to improve that? So we may refer cybersecurity posture, such as Global Cybersecurity Index by the ITU, but we may need a similar effort in cybercrime areas as well. We may need more specific tools, such as cybercrime statistics method, digital forensic laboratory quality assurance manual, to promote organizational management capability. In conclusion, today there are many CCB programs and projects consuming substantial resources for international development cooperation. However, it's not easy to assess actual results from the CCB projects because it's rarely spoken publicly. It's obvious there are many challenges to address in CCB programs. I discussed some of them today, but it must be much more complex tasks. To develop and implement the better programs and to evaluate the results objectively and to learn lessons from the improvement, we may need to share more information about them. We may need more researches. We may need to develop standardized methodologies together. I look forward to keep talking on this topic more often in the international forums for cybercrime in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. The presentation was very well organized and very informative. And thank you so much for illuminating a lot of important issues in the capacity building to combat cybercrime. Thank you once again very much for our distinguished speakers for sharing their valuable and insightful presentations.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Kang, Dr. Taekyoung Kang, Deputy Director of International Division at KIC. It's also my pleasure to be able to hear renowned experts' insight, as well as to be the moderator of this session on cyber economic crimes. As an academic, I look to appreciate and learn from your collective wisdom. According to Korean police, the number of cybercrime incidents in 2019 alone was well over 1.8 million. About 84% of the incidents were crimes perpetrated through the use of information and communications network. Against the backdrop, this session aimed to draw up effective responses to cyber economic crimes, given the current state of cyber financial fraud, phishing, and money laundering. In this session, we'll have 3 renowned presenters and 3 discussants. The first presenter is Dr. Erwin Rutger Lockerfeldt. Dr. Lockerfeldt is an academic director of the Cybersecurity Research Center of the Hogeschool of Applied Sciences. Over the last decade, he worked on a number of cybercrime studies for the Dutch government and private companies. Dr. Lockerfeldt will give a presentation on financial cybercrime and situational crime prevention. We'll look to gain insight into financial cybercrime prevention strategy based on understanding the origin and growth processes of cybercriminal networks. Now, Dr. Lockerfeldt, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. This is Rutger Lockerfeldt from the Netherlands. Today, I will be talking about financial cybercrimes and situational crime prevention. I work for the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement and the Hague University of Applied Sciences. The NCR is a Dutch research institute, and me and my colleagues all study crime and law enforcement, and I lead the cybercrime cluster. And there we are specialized in doing studies like life course criminology into cybercrime, criminal careers, the study of criminal networks, etc., etc. Very fundamental research. In the Hague University, we do much more applied research, and there we focus much more on the victim side of things. So I'm trying to combine both of these worlds in my work. Before I start, I also wanted to make sure that, I'm a criminologist. I study cybercrime, and cybercrimes are often seen as very technical crimes, which is, of course, true. However, we criminologists do have an important role in studying cybercrimes and better understanding cybercrimes, because the human factor still plays an important role, because I always say that the technical part is only a part of the modus operandi, and the attackers are still humans with their own motivations, with their own business models, with their own criminal careers. They work together with other criminals, so all of these processes of origin and growth are still very much important. And of course, the victims themselves also play a role willingly or unwillingly in the process of becoming a victim. So in the entire process of cybercrime, humans play a very vital role, and therefore criminologists should truly be much more involved into the study into cybercrime. So if you're interested in this topic, we published a research agenda a couple of years ago, as you can see on the left. You can download it for free, and we identified the major gaps in our knowledge related to human factor research into cybercrime and cybersecurity. We published it a couple of years ago, but I can tell you most of the topics that we then saw are still relevant today. The other publication I wanted to share with you is the one on the right, which is, to my knowledge, the latest book, edited book, about human factor research. And it contains about 19 chapters of international authors of all sorts of topics related to human factor in cybercrime research. So if you're interested in that, see if you can get access to the library and download some of the chapters. Of course, you can always send me or Thomas Holt an email about one of the chapters. So that's my basic introduction about the topic. I'm here to talk about cybercriminal networks that are carrying out financially motivated attacks. I published a number of studies about these criminal networks with various authors, as you can see on the slide here. So what I will do today is not tell you about one particular study, but more tell you about the main lines that we discovered over the past decade or so. And if you're interested in any of these studies, you can have a look at what you see on the screen here. So today I will be telling about cybercriminal networks, and all of the information I'm going to share with you is not only based on the papers I mentioned, but I think the most important aspect here is that it's based on the analysis of police files. In the Netherlands, we have access to police files. Well, not everybody, but if you're a scientist and if you have a good research idea and it can also help the police, then you're able to get access to police files. And this really helps us to break the walls of silence that are common when it comes to criminals, but might even be more in place when it comes to cyber criminals, because of course they don't really want to talk to researchers. They don't fill in surveys, so it's pretty hard to actually understand how they meet new people, how they recruit, how the networks start and then become larger, what the criminal capabilities are, etc., etc. So these police files are very relevant when it comes to finding out all sorts of details related to that matter, because of the wide use of wiretaps, but also IP taps, so literally a tap on your IP address, and interrogations if they are able to catch somebody, observations, placing listening devices into houses, and of course, raid a house, do a house search, and then seize all of the interesting materials and analyze what's on there, including computers, USB sticks, etc., etc. And we get access to all of this raw data, and we are able to use them in our analysis to better understand cybercriminal networks. So this is basically what my presentation is based upon. I started doing this with 18 Dutch cases, and I published a couple of papers about that. Later on, we did the same in other countries, and at the moment we're still working on the Organized Crime Monitor, which is an instrument that has been established in 1995 and contains lots of the major organized crime cases in the Netherlands, now also including cybercrime cases, and we're still doing analysis on that data set today. And why is this important? Let me take you back about 10 years ago. I was already doing lots of research for the Dutch police about cybercrime, cybercrime reports, etc., etc., and I heard a lot of stories about cybercrime is changing the game, and it's these criminals don't meet in a traditional way, and all of the trust building processes are not really don't really matter anymore, because now we have the dark web and crypto markets, etc., etc. And I was very intrigued by that as a criminologist, thinking, okay, so this might change all of the things we know about criminal networks and how they operate and how we can break them down or stop them. However, when I started looking into the scientific databases, I could not really find lots of criminological pieces on cybercriminal networks. I would often find pieces of papers of computer scientists that analyzed a big forum or whatever, but there were not really lots of criminologists active in the field of studying cybercriminal networks. And it is important because then I went back to the basics of traditional criminal networks, and I learned that most criminals don't work alone. Even for the most simple task, you have to use other people, and especially when it comes down to financially motivated crimes. Because you simply don't have all of the skills yourself to not only execute an attack, but also launder the money. So you need various people with various types of social capital. So social capital is contacts or skills or cash to be able to carry out financially motivated attacks successfully. Mind you, this is all still true for traditional criminal networks. So I was very intrigued if this was still true for cybercriminal networks, because if this is true, it means that your social network is very important, and we know that because criminals are not able to place an ad in a newspaper saying, "Hey, we're looking for somebody that can help us to launder money, or somebody that can help us carrying out certain attacks." No, of course that's not something that you can do. So how do they recruit new people? Over the lines of family ties, friendship ties, etc., etc. So your social network is basically your opportunity structure to get involved into all sorts of crime and criminal networks. Also meaning that if you would draw a social network analysis of one of these international networks, that you would see all of these clusters as you see on this slide, because in the end, your social relationships are highly clustered and they are limited. I don't know any people in Korea. This might be the opportunity for me to actually meet somebody there and set up a network there. But at the moment, I only know people in Europe. So my social network is limited to a certain region of the world. And we can definitely see that within criminal networks too. This is, for example, a network, a drug trafficking network. And you see on the top left corner, all of the drug dealers in Amsterdam. And they are, interchangeable because, we know lots of these people. However, the orange broker that you see connects them with the supplier in South America. So traditionally, the broker or the offender conversion setting would be very, very relevant to actually gain your focus your criminal investigation onto. Of course, now the big question is that still the same when it comes to cyber criminal networks? Because everybody was telling me, you have these crypto markets on the dark web, and well, they are there. This is an example of a somewhat older crypto market snapshot that we took a couple of years ago while we were monitoring about 27 of these markets. So these new criminal meeting places are there. And it also means that once you enter one of these meeting places, which is not very hard, by the way, you can just Google how you can enter one of these crypto markets. Once you enter them, it's very easy to get connected with people outside of your initial social network. So, for example, in this market, they're not only selling drugs, but also digital goods, which could be credit card credentials, which could be malware, etc., etc. So if I wanted to, get into contact with a malware writer from, let's say, Russia, this forum would enable me to do that in a very quick way. Furthermore, as they use rating systems and review systems, building trust is fairly easy, because just like eBay or another, auction site, once you've done a sell, the buyer is going to give you a review. So it's very easy to identify who are trustworthy sellers and buyers. So this is all changing, of course, the nature of how criminals meet, how they build up trust, etc., etc. The big question remains, however, are these crypto markets used by all of these criminal networks, and do they indeed change everything we know about criminal networks? And this was the focus of my studies into criminal networks. Our hypothesis was that all of these networks now relied heavily on crypto markets. They were short-lived, meaning they would find suitable co-offenders for a job. They would carry out the criminal activities and then find other people for the next job. And this was also something that you would see in all of these papers of computer scientists, that it was changing everything we know about crime. However, as you can see in the graph here, I have to explain this a little bit. Everything above the yellow dotted line is recruitment or ties based on these crypto markets or online ties at least. So it can also be a market on the clear web. And everything below the line is just recruitment over the traditional lines of offline social context. So we expected all of the networks that we would analyze to be type 4 networks, as you can see here, because in theory, you don't need any social context anymore because you can by yourself, go online, find other trustable sellers and other people that enable you to commit your crimes. And we actually saw a number of these networks. So they do exist, these type 4 networks, which are completely new and are completely changing everything we know about how criminals meet and interact and what it means for trust. However, as you can also see on the slide, is there are much more of these types. And the first one is especially very interesting because I was not expecting to see that at all. But there are also still criminal networks, cyber criminal networks out there that rely completely on social ties. So it's completely comparable to the traditional criminal networks that we know. And then there are new types of networks, so 2 and 3, which are a mixture of these offline ties and recruiting specialists online. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. And this is what I would do for every case that I analyzed, every police code that I analyzed, which could contain 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pages of material. I would try to boil it down to one paper with the hierarchy in there, the different roles, and all sorts of relevant information. And here you can see an Amsterdam phishing network, and I published about this in Trends in Organized Crime in 2014 because I thought this was a unique case and I'm never going to see it again. But this is a case of a phishing crew in Amsterdam that made about $1 million in a year during the investigation, the criminal investigation. So apparently, of course, they did make more than $1 million, but at least we know that for sure that during that period they made about $1 million. So they were a fairly successful phishing crew. However, as you can see, there is only one IT guy involved here, which is the orange icon that you can see. So this criminal network existed. Basically, all of the core members were, you could call them traditional street criminals of Amsterdam. They all had a very large criminal career already, dealing drugs, etc., etc. They had contacts with the Dutch police on various occasions. So they were known criminals, and they moved from dealing drugs to also committing cybercrimes. And they only needed one IT person to help them build these websites and make the databases required, etc., etc. And this is interesting because this successful cybercriminal network basically existed out of traditional street criminals that knew each other from the streets where they grew up. They recruited these bank employees and these postal employees and money mules along the lines of their social ties. So they would just go outside in their hood and try to get more people involved. And the IT guy they also knew from scams that they performed in the past. The IT guy was staged in Nigeria, and we know that because we got a tap. The police had a tap on his phone, so we actually knew everything about how they would develop new websites and stuff like that. So this is a very, very traditional network that carries out cybercriminal activities. The other example I want to give is a Latvian network, so an Eastern European network. And we know that they partly also executed their malware scams from England because the main writer was there. The other ones were all still in Latvia. And this is an interesting network because this is an example of a high-tech network that developed their own malware and were able to execute their scams in 7 different European countries successfully. The biggest problem, however, was not infecting computers with malware and not transferring money from victim accounts, but getting enough money mule accounts, because in European countries, every bank has a profile of its customer, and if I would send money in the middle of the night to Latvia, an alarm bell goes off, and the bank knows that something fishy is going on, so they're going to stop this transfer. So what this Latvian network needed was a local crew of money mules, and they were recruited along the lines of family ties. So they would just find people in the Latvian community in big cities in the Netherlands and other countries where they attack people, and they tried to recruit new people just by using their own social network. So again, you see a very high-tech network that can execute scams from Latvia and the UK into different European countries, but they still needed their local embeddedness. So we always have the picture of hackers or cyber criminals as, a guy in a hoodie sitting alone in his room, but this picture is also true. It's much more, fairly traditional criminals that are out there in our cities and in our regions. I want to also address really quickly one of our findings related to the use of Bitcoins. Because one thing that everybody always kept telling me is, okay, so Bitcoin is definitely, or other e-currencies are definitely going to change the need of money mules and stuff like that. Well, money mules are still out there, and they've been saying this to me for about 10 years, so it's not true. However, when you look at the crypto markets, of course, everybody's paying each other in e-currencies. I think at the moment, Bitcoin is the number one again, meaning that there is a black box indeed. However, we have excellent information from one of the cases that we analyzed in which the Dutch police took over one of these crypto markets and actually was able to investigate and observe the 5 biggest drug dealers, so these online drug lords. And indeed, they were selling their drugs over these crypto markets to customers all over the world, but mostly still in Europe. And they would receive their funds, their money, by getting Bitcoins. So indeed, it's very hard to trace it. But the key here is that these successful drug dealers that made hundreds of thousands of euros each month were not able to spend these Bitcoins because you need cash. And they ended up in the local Starbucks and McDonald's in train stations in the Netherlands to actually exchange their Bitcoins that they got from their online drug sales. And this is an interesting part because this is where the new types of criminals, so online drug lords selling stuff all over the world, getting Bitcoins, this is where that world meets the traditional underworld of the criminals. Of course, here they still needed people that were able to launder large amounts of cash. So here you can see the intertwinement of new networks and old networks, and still these crypto market drug lords still needed their local embeddedness to be able to get their money. And of course, that's the main priority, to get their money. So to wrap it up, we have new high-tech networks, but you also have traditional networks. And we tend to think that cybercrime is all about it's new, it's different, and that's partly true, and that gives us new problems. However, we have to remember that lots of these criminals are just humans and still try to work with people that they actually know. So we definitely see a fair amount of traditional networks here, and we see that cybercrimes and traditional crimes are highly intertwined. Furthermore, I want to emphasize the offline side of cybercrime. As I already mentioned, lots of these networks still heavily rely on offline social context. I think Jonathan Lusthaus, which is a discussant later on, has some excellent work that he did in Romania that shows exactly the same, that these networks there are heavily relying on their offline social context. So we can definitely see that from multiple sources, this is something that we see. And this, of course, gives lots of possibilities for law enforcement to still do some investigations and see who the recruiters are, etc., etc. And the local embeddedness, as I just mentioned in the Bitcoin case, still is very important. I do not want to downplay, of course, the new element of within cybercriminal networks. So these new online offender convergence settings, so the crypto markets or other meeting places, because we definitely see that these online ties are on the rise. So more and more of these ties become online ties, which is definitely going to change the origin and growth processes of these criminal networks. And we definitely see that these offender conversion settings are opportunity structures to quickly expand your criminal capabilities, because we did notice that the criminals that were able to use both their offline networks and their online networks were able to quickly become an international player. And of course, this is something that is new. And last but not least, we see that these crypto markets or fora in general are universities of the underworld. So traditionally, I would have said, go to prison. That's where you learn a lot from other criminals. We see prison as the university for criminals. However, now it's changing to forums and crypto markets, because there is a big culture in there where it's completely normal to learn people all sorts of criminal stuff and to discuss new ways to commit fraud, etc., etc. So this is definitely something new and very interesting to see what it means to the criminal careers of young offenders. So this is it for me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them after the presentation, and you can also contact me directly in the future on the email address that you see on the sheet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lukefeld, for your insightful presentation on the interaction between human factors and cybercriminal networks. And I respect your enthusiastic, positivist endeavor. Now, the next presenter is Dr. Benoit Dupont. Dr. Dupont is a professor of criminology at Université de Montaigne, where he also holds a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity and the Research Chair in the Prevention of Cybercrime. Professor Dupont will give presentation on cybercrime and government responses in the time of COVID-19. We look to understand how cybercriminals adapt existing fraudulent schemes to the new context created by COVID-19. Professor Dupont, the floor is yours.
So hello, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity given to me to present to this great audience. My name is Benoit Dupont. I'm a professor of criminology at the Université de Montréal in Canada. And the title of my presentation today is Cybercrime and Government Responses in the Time of COVID. The outline of my presentation will deal with the co-evolution of cybercrime and cyber threats in a time of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently experiencing. I will look at the co-evolution of the virus, which is a biological virus, and how the digital viruses and infections have co-evolved alongside this biological virus. I will also look at how cyber criminals and cyber offenders have exploited and leveraged the current feeling of fear and uncertainty. And I will also briefly look at the government responses in 9 countries, the G7 countries, plus the Netherlands and Australia, to try to assess how effective those responses have been. And finally, I will conclude by a few thoughts on cyber resilience as maybe a substitute to cybersecurity. COVID-19, as we've discovered, has not only been a terrible public health crisis, but also has amplified a number of online risks, among which cybercrime figures prominently. Why? Because it enhanced levels of uncertainty and fear among the population, which has sought a lot of information online and sometimes in places that have been compromised by cyber criminals and cyber attackers. Also because with the lockdowns imposed by many countries, millions of workers have shifted overnight to remote work or work from home arrangements, where they have been forced to work with applications and in environments that were not necessarily very conducive to security. Thirdly, because the critical infrastructures on which we rely to deliver public health and care to sick people and to people infected by the virus have also been proven to be very fragile and very exposed to digital attacks. And finally, because the quest, the race for a vaccine has also exacerbated a number of espionage and disruptive behaviors from nation states that have actually compromised the health of our digital ecosystem. So COVID-19 is the perfect example of what my Dutch colleagues call a transboundary crisis, which is a crisis that affects multiple jurisdictions. So it's a global pandemic, undermines the functioning of various policy sectors and critical infrastructures. So for example, in the case of COVID-19, the public health institutions have been stressed and have been really tested. Digital infrastructures as well have been tested. National security has also been stressed. And of course, transport, infrastructures, accommodation, tourism, and many other policy sectors have been affected by COVID-19. A transboundary crisis is also a crisis that escalates very rapidly and morphs along the way. And there is still a lot of uncertainty about COVID-19 and what will happen next. So there is no existing model of that can predict what will happen in a few weeks or in a few months. And for all those reasons, those transboundary crises are extremely difficult to manage and very challenging for governments and even the private sector to address. So I would like to look at very briefly the ways that cyber criminals have adapted and have leveraged the COVID-19 crisis to transform their existing strategies to victimize individuals and organizations. And I will look at a handful of changes that have occurred for the past 8 months. So the first type of cybercrime that has evolved as a result of COVID-19 are online scams. They have been delivered on a constant basis since the beginning of the crisis by email, by SMS, through websites. And basically, they consist in cyber criminals exploiting the need for information and protection of individuals to offer them fake vaccines, fake testing kits, fake or counterfeited protective equipment, fake travel authorizations in exchange for money. And this effectiveness of online scams is fueled by the disorganization of government communications during the early days of the pandemic and even up until now. So it's maybe too early to assess at this stage if COVID-19 generated higher profits for cyber criminals and the extent of those increased profits, but there is a certainty is that really it has enabled new types of scams at massive scales. It also has enabled cyber criminals to increase the effectiveness of the distribution of malware-enabled data theft stratagems. So this is a screen capture of a malware called Farade, which is an information stealer where cyber criminals are exploiting, again, the appetite and the need for information that people have with a title that pretends to give them some of this information on coronavirus affected company staff to convince people to click on the link and to download a malicious piece of software. And the purpose here is not to defraud people or to extort money, but more to acquire and to steal personal information that can then be repackaged and sold on underground illicit markets. In the field of fraud, a third type of fraud that was massively exploited by organized cybercrime groups is the exploitation of the financial aid programs that were launched by governments all across the world to try to salvage collapsing economies and to try to support families and businesses throughout this crisis. So the governments hastily deployed social benefit programs and business support programs, emergency programs that consisted of hundreds of billions of dollars very often, but with limited time and hence limited controls, so that it enabled cybercrime gangs to exploit these windows of opportunities and to submit fake claims on behalf of the people they had stolen the identity of. And of course, those people were doubly victimized because when they tried to claim actually those benefits for themselves, they discovered that someone had already made such claim and they had to clear their name before they were able to enjoy those benefits. So it's hard to assess at this stage, but probably at least in the US, 2 to 3% of those government programs resulted in fraudulent claims, which doesn't seem to be that much, except when you consider that those programs consisted in hundreds of billions of dollars. So the estimate is that tens of billions of dollars were defrauded in the process. Also, cyber criminals exploited COVID-19 to launch disruption campaigns under the guise of distributed denial of service attacks or ransomware attacks. And those attacks exploited the fatigue and the exhaustion of personnel working in critical infrastructures and at home, but in particular at hospitals and research labs. And we heard a lot of horror stories about that. And they also exploited the sense of urgency that was attached to the work of critical infrastructures and public health institutions. And as an example, a university in California paid a $1 million ransom because otherwise it would have lost the research it was doing on a potential COVID-19 vaccine. So a lot of malware disruptions occurred as a result, exploiting, again, the uncertainty and the exhaustion and the fatigue of internet users. Also, in the same kind of configuration, millions of people started to work from home overnight, increasing the number of devices connecting to corporate systems from outside of the protected areas, accessing corporate data over consumer networks. Users also working from home were a lot more distracted because very often their family was holed up with them in the same dwelling, received very limited security support, had to work using applications they were not familiar with and for which they hadn't received any kind of security training. So overall, we saw a decrease in the effectiveness of security controls, and that resulted in a number of attacks and higher rates of infections, of digital infections. Finally, cyber criminals were very opportunistic and exploited also the launch of contact tracing apps developed by governments to try to digitalize the contact tracing operations to slow down the spread of the virus. And for example, in Canada, and this is a screen capture from Canada, cyber criminals set up fake websites pretending to come from Health Canada and made available fake apps only 6 days after the government of Canada announced it was going to produce, design, and deliver a contact tracing app. So you see the fast speed at which cyber criminals are able to leverage government initiatives to convince people to download malicious software and to access privileged information. So if we try to map all those online risks, we see that there are three main categories of malicious actors that were involved. Cyber criminals driven by the need to generate financial profits, government hackers trying to launch espionage operations to appropriate intellectual property, and state-sponsored hackers coming in between, semi-autonomous from government institutions. Basically, they launched into three different kinds of objectives: to defraud victims, to steal data, to resell those personal informations, and to appropriate intellectual property, and also destabilize adversary governments. And in terms of victims, we see 5 different categories of victims: individuals, businesses, critical infrastructures, a specific sector of critical infrastructures, the health sector, and government systems. And what we see through this flow chart is that actually when you're a victim, you have to account for and prepare for different types of attacks and different types of risks. So you have to be prepared for a variety of risks that evolve. And we can also see that attackers sometimes launch different types of attacks. So it's not so easy to detect and to predict exactly what attackers are going to do. So there is really a cybercrime coevolution that we saw over the past 8 months. It's interesting to see that when you're mapping what cybercriminals did, they followed local developments in the pandemic and the diffusion of the pandemic. Most of the scams and online attacks we recorded started in Asia and then moved to Europe and then later on to North America. And those patterns closely reflect the spread of the virus and very quickly are able to exploit changes in the statistics of infections and the rates of infections. They also very often are able to identify the most vulnerable sectors and the most vulnerable individuals and to exploit those social or organizational vulnerabilities. And we see that they have really, cyber criminals, a very, very high level of adaptation, which is very rarely matched by public organizations in charge of defending computer systems. In terms of the timeline, you can see the spread of those frauds, the attacks against hospitals, when you see the rise in the number of people being admitted to hospitals in Europe and North America, government programs being launched very immediately, frauds start to happen, attacks against contact tracing applications later on in the beginning of the summer, and phishing campaigns remain quite stable throughout the whole 8-month period. When we look at government responses, we mainly are able to categorize those responses in 3 categories, 3 buckets: prevention, response, and recovery. So the before, during, and after, hopefully. In terms of prevention, lots of awareness campaigns were launched on social media, providing guidance to individuals, businesses, and critical health infrastructures. But what we found is that very often they didn't have a very broad reach in the population, and they were limited in their capacity to reach large numbers of people. And in general, there was a lack of preparation that we observed, except maybe in a couple of countries such as the UK. And the prevention programs were very static. They didn't evolve as quickly as the threats and as the types of cybercrimes that were deployed. So sometimes the prevention and the awareness campaigns were somehow disconnected from the content of the scam and phishing emails that people were receiving. In terms of response, limited government capacity to support mitigation activities through such a massive crisis, limited citizen engagement to help with the detection and mitigation of threats, such as suspicious emails, except in the UK, where a system was implemented to help people declare suspicious emails and to help the authorities suppress those emails. And in terms of response, we saw important intergovernmental partnerships with, for example, the Five Eyes countries and European Union countries, public-private partnerships not so great partnerships between the national and the local governments in those 9 countries that we studied. And finally, in terms of recovery, probably too early to assess. What we know is the technical resilience of the digital infrastructure, the internet, the cloud, was quite robust. What wasn't so robust is the capacity of the critical infrastructure in the health sector to deal with, for example, cyber attacks and ransomware, which in fact are quite easy to prevent and could have been prevented and mitigated much more easily. So it leads me to conclude that by saying that cyber resilience, which is the capacity to limit the impact of cyber disruption and to restore normal operations following a cyber incident and to adapt to a new threat landscape, is not so developed. We only witnessed a handful of countries that seem to have developed some good cyber resilience. In the UK, we saw a very nimble communication strategy to adapt to the new threat landscape, relying on new social media platform. In Australia, massive investments pledged over 10 years to enhance the level of preparedness. In Canada, it's not on my slide, but some interesting new partnerships between academic research labs and intelligence agencies to try to better help those research labs protect against cyber attacks. But overall, I think we're still lagging behind in terms of cyber resilience. And I think it's one of the lessons probably of this crisis. We need to maybe recognize that cybersecurity is probably not enough, and we need to really adopt a more cyber resilient posture or approach, which is more focused on the future and tries to develop the capacities to operate in very highly uncertain environment. I'm going to stop here because I want to leave some time for Q&As, but if you'd like to contact me or to reach out to me or to download some of my papers, feel free to email me or to visit this website. Thank you very much for the quality of your attention.
Thank you, Professor Dupont, for your keen analysis on how cyber criminals exploit people's vulnerability deepened by COVID-19 and expert view on governmental response strategy. And I think your organic conception of cyber resilience very useful tool to analyze government's response strategy. Now, next and our last presenter is Dr. Hae-sung Yoon. Dr. Yoon is Senior Research Fellow of KIC and a consultant to Korean National Police Agency, National Counterterrorism Center. Dr. Yoon will give a presentation on application of fraud and remediation for crime victimization on voice phishing method. We look to understand the Korean legislative and policy responses to voice phishing phenomenon and its various types of victimizations. Dr. Yoon, the floor is yours.
네, 소개받은 한국 형사정책.
Hello, I'm Yoon Hae-sung from KIC. So our institute organizes these international fora every December of the year, inviting renowned experts to talk about cybercrime, corruption, and terrorism. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to transition the meeting to a virtual format, which leaves a lot of regrets on our part. But our international cooperation team actually has put in a lot of efforts to prepare for this meeting. And of course, it would have been great if we had an offline meeting. And KIC has done a lot of research. So what I would like to present to you is to introduce Korea's unique legal framework based on the research work conducted by KIC. So I would like to deliver my presentation on the topic of voice phishing. So voice phishing is not a traditional cybercrime per se. You had farming and fishing in the past. So this is a representative crime that would use cyberspace or cybercrime. As was the speaker from Canada spoke about, it is made of dotted organizations. It's an international organization using fishing and farming and conducting all of the attacks in the cyberspace. So this voice phishing can be perceived as a cybercrime. So you use private data using voice to phish that data. So this is a new words combining voice, private data, and phishing. If you look at the literature review in Korea, there have been largely two trends in Korea. It's a credit loan fraud that's requesting personal and financial information by luring potential victims into their fake websites. And the user would access the site and thinking that it is a real website would provide personal and financial information to that website. So the fraud using that genuine personal and financial information would go to the actual real site and enter that information to go through authentication process and take cash or to do a transfer of money into his or her account. That is what we have seen in terms of car loan fraud in Korea. So whether it is phishing or farming, they would use those tools to lure the user to a fake website. So how do we treat this under the current Criminal Act? That is a controversies or debates that we have because the fake websites are used for committing a crime and a user thinking that that is an actual site actually enter that information by him, herself, or herself, and the fraud would be able to utilize that information to take property from the actual site or make the cash card to extract money. That is a type of behavior that we saw. So from the point of the victim could think that I had no idea what was going on and I thought that was a real, genuine website and I put in my personal information and financial information. How would you be able to treat that as a fraud because it is actually seen as a pre-execute phase to fraud? So it is quite questionable whether that act of obtaining personal financial information can be admitted to this. So now let's take a look at the types of voice phishing frauds. There are 4 different types. First is compensation type. For example, this is a type of attracting victims for winning prizes or for refunding overpaid pensions, insurance, or taxes. The person would be lured to go to the ATM to put personal information to take the money out. Second is the security type. This is a type of attracting the victims from financial information, leaks, or involvement in crimes. So the person is told by the criminal that the person is at risk of infringement, so you would have to go to the ATM to put some money in to protect yourself. And the third is a blackmail type. This is, for example, deceiving victims into believing that their child has been abducted. The fourth type is charging duty. This is a type of attracting victims to pay membership fees for alumni associations or additional tuition fees. But as you can see from different typologies, for the blackmail type and for the charging duty type, the person is aware that the money is being provided to the criminal or to the person. So that's a punishable act, and the person is aware that the money is being transferred. But the problem actually occurs with the first 2 types, compensation and the security types. You will be able to learn from later examples that the person is not aware that the money is being issued from his or her account. Now, the person is not aware that the disposal of the property is being made. So whether that constitutes an element of fraud or not. Hence the controversies that we see in the current discourse. Let's take a look at the current Criminal Act of Korea. First of all, there has to be an act of deception And from that, there has to be a disposal activity, and it has to lead to property losses or damages. And the person has to be aware of that. And once the property losses incur, then the fraud takes the gains made from the property disposal. Then it becomes an element of a crime for fraud under the current Criminal Act. But as you saw from the previous examples, there has to be an act of disposal of a property. Only then such behavior would constitute crime element. So let's go back to the fraud element again. Let's say that there's a refund type, or there's a security type, or blackmail type of an act. Let's say that this surprises occur, then the victim would have to do whatever is told by the criminal. And the criminal would impersonate himself or herself as a police officer and would tell the victim to do certain things, telling the person to go to the ATM, and he or she would tell the victim that the phone call will be made in 5 minutes, and then the victim goes to the ATM, will wait for the call to come through, and picks up the phone, and the fraud will give specific instructions as to, for example, what to do with the ATM. So this is the only way that you can, for example, clear yourself of any suspicions. So it's a luring activity. So the person will go through the authentication process with the ATM, and the authentication code will be given, for example, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or other codes will be given to the person, and also the security code will be given by the criminal. 245, 267, the codes will be given to the victim, but that's actually an account number of the criminal that will be used later on. And the security code is actually the amount of money that will be transferred out of the victim's account. So the victim has been deceived at this point. And so the victim has no idea that the money is being transferred out of her or his account to a criminal's account. So under the Criminal Act, this act is not perceived as a disposal activity. Because there's an absence of disposal, such act was not punishable under the fraud element. So there's a compensation type and the security type. There's a lack of disposal. However, for the blackmail type and the charging duty type, the victim actually transmits or transfers money out of the bank account, so any act of transfer would be punishable under the fraud crime. So again, the third and the fourth type can be punished under the fraud crime element, but the first and second cannot be punished under the fraud element. But fortunately, in 2017, such loophole was to be addressed. There was an en banc Supreme Court decision made, especially looking at this very sophisticated and advanced voice phishing crimes. Even if there's an absence of disposal of a property, such credit card loans or security type or the compensation types could still be punishable under the fraud crime element, even if there was an absence of, again, the disposal of a property. So that was a decision made by the Supreme Court back in 2017. Nevertheless, because such en banc Supreme Court decision was not available, there was a argument that we would have to review this under the Criminal Act. Now, there is a computer-aided fraud crime which can be applied to the voice phishing act. For example, the person is lured to the ATM to make a transfer. So the person, the victim, is actually used as an accessory to the crime. So the person is to be seen as a principal through innocent human agent. The criminal is to be seen as a principal through innocent human agent. because the victim was actually used in the act of crime. So in 2017, but the Supreme Court made that decision en banc. So this act of using an innocent human agent is still punishable by fraud crime element. Even if there's an absence of disposal of property under the voice phishing. So there was that Supreme Court decision made. So such voice phishing crimes can be punished as a fraud crime in Korea. And I want to introduce to you a very unique legal framework that we have. When we did the research before, for example, the victims would be deceived by voice phishing a criminal, and within 20 minutes, other frauds, for example, the co-offenders would take that money out of the bank account and would transfer safely that money to another account. Then the victim will be made aware only then that he or she was deceived and would make a report, but you would have to make that report right away and to the police, and the money, the account would have to be frozen, which means that you have to actually go to the separate bank to ask for that request to put a freeze on the bank transactions, and it would really take up a lot of time. So in order for the person to actually get that money back, he or she would have to file a litigation. So there's a very long time period needed, also costing a lot of money. That is why the victim, in most of the time, would not be able to get a recourse for the damages, which led to these issues over the loopholes in the legal framework. So over the course of 1 year, the National Assembly was involved in this consultation, and a special act was legislated as a result. So the biggest change is that they were different reporting systems across the board. Some of the benchmarks were used from Japan and Taiwan. Now here, the victim is aware that he or she has been a victim of voice phishing, and a report will be made to the police. And the police will say, please wait, and we will talk to the financial authorities, and we will make a report. So please make sure to report to your financial authorities, for example, to ask for the suspension. So make sure that the person is able to wait online without hanging up the phone, and the financial authorities will answer the phone, and the request will be made by the victim for suspending the bank account transactions, and that request will be accepted right away. So that is what we're doing. So it's very real time. For example, you would have to separately report to the police and also to the financial authorities, and at least minimum 6 months will be needed in order to get a recourse for the losses. But once you make a report to the police, you'll be instantly rerouted to the financial authorities to make a request for the suspension of payment. And Japanese law was used as a benchmark. Let's say that the fraud doesn't show up, because a fraud will then have to admit that he or she has committed the crime. So the fraud doesn't actually appear. So up until that actual owner appears, then there's a 2 months of a bond waiting period. And unless the person appears, then the money will be put back to the original owner's account. That is the Special Act on the Prevention of Losses Caused by Telecommunications-Based Financial Fraud and Refund for Loss. In short, Voice Phishing Special Act. But still, the behaviors of crime are becoming very intelligent and diversified. So the Supreme Prosecutor's Office, as well as police agency and financial authorities, are working very hard in collaboration to respond to such voice phishing crimes. What I would like to emphasize is that the government, institute, or organizations would never request an individual to provide financial information, especially will never lure an individual to go to the ATM to put some number in. So don't be fooled, don't be deceived by voice phishing criminals. And if you have been deceived, you need to make a report to the police right away. That was quite a short presentation, but I've talked about the typologies of voice phishing in Korea and also the remedial procedures in place. And I will take questions later during the discussion session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Yoon, for your well-articulated and informative presentation on types of voice phishing and judicial and legislative responses to them in Korea. Now, we have entered the end of the session. I extend once again my deep gratitude to all panelists for taking time to share with us insightful views on cyber financial crime. The second day of the forum is scheduled tomorrow morning, and I look forward to having you again. Please stay healthy and connected. Thank you very much.